Well, it's a pleasure to be here at the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame in New Westminster, British Columbia. And we've been going across the country and talking with a lot of builders, players, and historians about the history of this great game of lacrosse. And with me here today, I have Bruce MacDonald and David Stewart-Candy here, who both are closely associated with the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame. And really looking forward to talking about some of the areas that you have a real love of and knowledge of, and sharing that with people for posterity. So I guess before we get started on the lacrosse part, maybe we can start with Bruce for a moment. Bruce, what did you actually do for a living before pursuing your passion, which history doesn't often pay very well?
Well, it doesn't. But it's worth it in other ways, many other ways. Yeah. I've always made a living as a writer. I worked in Toronto in the advertising business for about 20 years, and I worked a little bit in advertising and marketing in Vancouver when I moved back to Vancouver. I'm also a teacher, and I write history books and other kinds of books on commission. So it's always been writing based for me, what I've done for a living.
Very good. And David, you're more of a numbers guy in a lot of ways, aren't you, right? So tell us about what you do during the week.
Okay, well, my day job is I work for the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver, and more behind the scenes, one of my aspects I do is inventory control. And I did that before I even worked for the Real Estate Board, and that kind of led into where my interest with statistics came, with sports. I was always interested in ice hockey and soccer and stuff, and when I got involved with lacrosse it was about 17, 18 years ago, I brought that passion over to lacrosse and then realized that there was like a void that needed to be researched, and that's kind of where I found my little niche and stepped in there. So the numbers brought me over, and then Bruce here got me more interested in the story side of stuff. So.
And you're kind of a perfect example of that, because you have two books that you've done, and one is really numbers oriented and one's story oriented, right?
Yeah, both are essentially numbers, but when I did the research for the Pro League, I guess I was getting asked a lot of info about these players besides their numbers. And what kind of stemmed it was somebody was trying to induct Newsy Lalonde into the British Columbia Sports Hall of Fame. And I was asked to verify this info. And I'm like, okay, well, let me sit down and write up something about him. And when I saw the finished product of that, I'm like, wow, you know what? Like, maybe I should do that for some other players. And so I kind of went back to some of my old news clippings and stuff like that, and then just slowly, assembled these stories. And some of these players' stories, they just write themselves. It's very easy to find the info. Some of them you really have to look through the newspapers. And then there's some players that, they're in the Hall of Fame, but we don't know more than a couple sentences about. And it's difficult to try to find those stories. But Bruce really inspired me. When Bruce did his Salmon Bellies book, and he's a real storyteller, and kind of encouraged me to do that with like my little niche, which is the pro field game.
Oh, very good. And David referred to your beautiful book that you've put out, Bruce, and tell us a little bit about that book and why I guess you pursued that.
I was raised in New Westminster, near Queen's Park Arena, the mecca for lacrosse in Western Canada, maybe in all of Canada. That was in the 1960s when I was growing up there. And of course I was aware that something important was happening at the arena on Thursday nights and sometimes on the Saturday weekends. But from an early age I was aware that there was a team playing there, and they were called the Salmon Bellies. And as I got a little bit older, my father would take me to the games, or I'd go to the games on my own, and I had friends that started playing lacrosse. And I guess my natural historic curiosity really started kicking in even in those early days. I read a lot of history books, and I started thinking at an early age about this team. Who exactly were they? In my sort of young imagination, I always thought of the Salmon Bellies, particularly when I'd go watch them, as being kind of a paramilitary outfit. They were sort of the shock troops that were defending the honor of the city of New Westminster in my mind. They seemed just so pivotal, so important to the city and to the history of the city. And so, of course, naturally, these heroic figures on the lacrosse floor defending the city. It was a very heroic sort of a wonderful time. These were the 1960s and 70s teams in particular. Won a lot of Man Cups in that time period. So I got very curious about where did they come from? And they seem so tied in with the rest of the history of New Westminster. New Westminster has a fascinating history that goes back to 1859, and the team, it turned out, is almost as old. 1889, 1888, 89, they started a team, a lacrosse team. But of course, you know, other things intervened, and I went to work in Toronto, and I had a family, and but in the back burner of my mind, I was always thinking, boy, I'd like to write something about that team someday. Never really knowing how that would happen, but it came about because when I moved back to the coast, I was looking for things to do, and I started a little book making company, doing books on commission for people, family histories and things like that. And I met a fellow named Ian Matheson who was involved with the executive of the Salmon Bellies in the late 60s, early 70s. And I just happened to mention to him, we were chatting one day, that I'd always wanted to write a book on the Salmon Bellies, which is true. And Ian is a real mover and shaker. And he said, well, isn't that interesting? That would be a great project. Why don't you put a proposal together and come and pitch a group of Salmon Bellies alumni? And I said, well, that would be great. So I did. I put a pitch together, a proposal, really more than a pitch. And I went and met with 5 or 6 individuals that were, you know, associated with the Salmon Bellies in a very long-term way. And they said, great, go ahead, let's do it. So really the book is the result of the Salmon Bellies alumni stepping up and finding a way of funding it and working with the city to get it done. And I went ahead and spent about 4 years researching and writing the book. It just consumed me. I found it so fascinating, so interesting. I spent, I don't know, hundreds of hours at the New Westminster Public Library. So the New Westminster Museum and Archives, the city of New Westminster, they're all behind the project. The mayor was behind it, had the alumni support. So that's how it came about.
Now, Bruce, I understand you've been working on another book on lacrosse. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've written another book called Minnow and Man that comes out of the Salmon Bellies book. I did a lot of research that did make it into the Salmon Bellies book. There's a lot of other stories that need to be told. Of course, in telling the Salmon Bellies story, there's always 2 teams involved, so really the Salmon Bellies book is a history of Canadian lacrosse. But there were lots of other stories that I wanted to write about. So I created a second book. I've researched it, I've written it, I've gathered together photos that have mostly never or seldom been seen before, called Minnow and Man. And it goes into the stories of teams like the St. Catharines Athletics of the 1940s, the Aurelia Terriers of the 1930s. These are terrific teams that are mostly forgotten now. It even goes back as far as the turn of the century into David's area of expertise, the early pro lacrosse leagues. I write about the Montreal Shamrocks, who were the first great professional team, had an amazing team. Of course, there's a chapter or 2 on the New Westminster Salmon Bellies with some additional research that I've done. And the book goes all the way up to almost to the present day. So there's 6 Nations teams in there. There's Victoria teams. Anybody that had a kind of a dynastic team over the last over 100 years. Dynastic, by my definition, is they've won 3 or more Man Cups in a 10-year period. If you've done that, your organization has done that, then you've got a chapter in the book. I also included a few chapters on some of the junior teams that won the Minnow Cup, such as the Oshawa Green Gales and others, so that anybody that won, say, 3 or more Minnow Cups in a 10-year period is also in the book.
So is this book ready except for the printing?
It's ready to go. Lacrosse history has been, I'd say, underserved in the past. I think it deserves far more attention historically, far more support in terms of fan support and everything else. So it's unfortunate that the historical support hasn't been there. I'm hoping that's going to change. It is one of Canada's national sports. It probably deserves more backing, I think. one way or another, we're hoping we can interest a publisher and get the book out there. I think the best way to preserve history is in a book. There's a lot of things online these days, but how long that material survives and in what form really is uncertain. So I think the book is the way to go, and one day we're going to get that book done.
Well, wish you the best of luck on that, and it sounds like it's something that needs to happen. So let's hopefully we can find someone out there to step up on that. So, David, let's move over to yourself. And most people have no idea that professional lacrosse existed in Canada over 100 years ago. I think most people assume the game back then was always amateur. What happened, and how did pro field lacrosse develop?
Well, the pro games started back east, mostly in Montreal, and Bruce mentions the Montreal Shamrocks. There's a lot of Shamrock teams. Everyone had a Shamrock team, but Montreal Shamrocks, they started doing under-the-table payments, kind of rise from when the Minnow Cup was instituted in 1901, and it was originally a national championship of Canada. And that's how it was defined. And originally it was amateur teams that competed for it, but then the prestige of the trophy slowly increased, and then you started getting teams paying for players under the table. And after, within about 5 years, it was kind of accepted that, okay, you know what, we'll let professionals in. A lot of people don't realize that back 100 years ago, even 80 years ago, there was a real cultural divide between amateurism and professionalism. And once you had either competed against a professional team or as a professional, it was literally like a stain on you. And professional games where the players were and where the money was, but there were a lot of people that did look down at the professional game. But the professional game started in the back east, and of course we had lacrosse out west here from about 1886, 1890s when it kind of got established, and the money slowly came west as well. And when New Westminster won the Minnow Cup in 1908, they were the last amateur team to win it, and they beat a professional team. And because they'd played a professional team, they defeated the Montreal Shamrocks, those players were now stained with professionalism. Even though they weren't pros, they could not play against other amateurs. So they were basically left alone on the West Coast. What do we do for competition? And around this time, there was a guy named Con Jones, and he ran the Vancouver club. And Con Jones was a bookie, sports promoter, had a lot of money, had a lot of access to money, and he kind of stepped in and got a Vancouver pro team going. And that's how it got established on the coast. And you had this 2-team pro league that was really intense. The crowds here were massive. And as the game kind of got a foothold and established on the West Coast, it died in the East Coast for the same reason that as the money dried up, the teams that survived just had no one to play against. And by 1920, the pro game ended back east. It went a little longer in the West, and it only died because of Con Jones stepping out due to health reasons. And then it just dropped.
Yeah, and I understand baseball was taking a lot of the momentum away from lacrosse in those days.
At least in the West Coast, I think baseball was here. Hockey wasn't, and I think that was what kind of did it in too, is that we don't have the weather for outdoor hockey. So when sports came to Vancouver and came to New Westminster and Victoria, lacrosse was just a really perfect game to fit in. It was an everyman's sport. There was places to play. But when hockey got a foothold here in Vancouver and New Westminster in 1911, that was kind of almost the first sort of, bell toll kind of thing that there's, that hockey was now going to start infringing onto the lacrosse fan base. And what kind of hurt lacrosse was that when World War I came along, for patriotic reasons and stuff, lacrosse stopped. We stopped for 2 years. No lacrosse, no amateur, no pro. Hockey didn't do that. And the hockey league that was here continued on. And those 2 years almost took all the fan base away. Because you still have sports fans. They're not going to stop watching sports for 2 years. They're going to go elsewhere. Yeah, and that seemed to be the transition point. And then lacrosse did get revived after the war, but it was always, by then, it was like the second brother kind of thing. But before the First World War, lacrosse was huge. It was just, the crowds are still larger than what we get for the NLL today. and it's just incredible.
Now, one of those early pros that was brought out was Newsy Lalonde, right?
Yeah.
And what year did he first come out under a paid contract?
He came west in 1908 with Regina. Newsy was the ultimate pro. He's like the Babe Ruth of lacrosse, and he would go where the money was. And in 1908, Regina assembled a ringer team of really good players, and Newsy was one of them. And they came out west to try to challenge the New Westminster Salmon Bellies for the Minnow Cup, and they lost. While that was going on, Con Jones saw Newsy, and he's like, I could have you for my Vancouver team. And so he, Con Jones had the money, and so that's how Newsy came west. Sometimes he would go back to Montreal if Montreal was, flying a few more dollars around than Jones had at the time. But yeah, he just would go anywhere the money was.
And I heard he made more money playing lacrosse than he did NHL hockey.
That's the story. Yeah, the Newsy Lalonde's wages. Every newspaper article that talks about it back then, they throw different numbers around. It's mythical, but yeah, he was earning more money playing lacrosse than he did hockey. Yeah.
Yeah, there's always been that connection between the NHL and lacrosse right through the ages. Up through Jack Bionda and that side of it.
The lacrosse players back then, there's a lot of multi-sports guys. They played not only hockey, some of them played baseball, some played soccer. People did that, but then if you were a pro, you couldn't play amateur, and that actually shut out a few. There was actually one player who was he's a championship something or other in amateur sports, and he had to stop competing because he was a pro.
Bruce, when and why did the Salmon Bellies join the pro ranks?
They joined the pro ranks because they were they wanted to compete against the best, and probably the guys put so much time into playing the game, and the crowds were so big that they probably thought they should be compensated, and they should have been compensated. So they kind of got swept up in a kind of a lacrosse euphoria. It was the biggest game in town. There was no bigger game in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, New Westminster, certainly New Westminster, than lacrosse. As David said, they're getting 10, sometimes 12, 15,000 for championship games, people coming out. So people are paying 25 cents or so, sometimes 50 cents for grandstand seats to these games. So they had no choice but to kind of renounce their amateurism and join these pro ranks. If they wanted to play the best teams, they'd have to also be professionals themselves. I don't think the guys playing in those days minded being branded professionals. There was some resistance through various lacrosse organizations, authorities. There was a great debate that raged. David's referenced it about the virtues of amateur sport versus professional. Professionalism in sport was equated with the Americans, and of course there was some friction between the United States and Canada, sort of culturally and socially. So the professionalism in the States was kind of not wanted in Canada, which at the time we're talking about, Canada is very British-centric, very we're a dominion of the greater United Kingdom, and a lot of the British traditions and social customs came to Canada. Of course, there's the French influence too, but we're kind of talking about Ontario and British Columbia.
Well, I was wondering what year that happened for the Salmon Bellies, I guess, when they did make the leap.
Well, as Dave says, the Salmon Bellies made that leap officially, I guess you'd say, in 1908 when they played the Shamrocks in Montreal for the Minnow Cup.
But in terms of paying the players, was it that year as well? Or?
1909, I think. The
probably
following year, it kind of
1909, somewhere around there. It's hard to determine because, of course, historically, unfortunately, we don't have the records. We don't really know. We just have newspaper reports to rely on.
The Salmon Bellies too. Salmon Bellies in Vancouver, they were bankrolled differently. Like Salmon Bellies, my understanding was, apart from maybe one or two players brought east, they were all paid out of a common pool, while Vancouver, their players are all negotiated contracts. And that actually caused some friction in Vancouver because Easterners who got paid more often didn't perform, and then there was actually a strike in Vancouver on the team. The local players were like, well, we're carrying away the team, why aren't we getting more money? And Con Jones said, well, see you later, and kicked him off the team.
Well, we still see arguments over money in this day and age with the pro lacrosse that's here now, you know.
Things haven't necessarily changed, the sort of friction between amateurism and professional. I mean, it still exists in Canadian lacrosse today, just in a different guise with the NLL and then the summer lacrosse leagues. Yeah. The push and pull continues. It was the same in 1910 as it is today, just slightly different, but essentially the same issue.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
So that has continued, whereas say other sports such as say hockey, that's not an issue anymore. It's clear cut. You're a professional or you're in a different league. It's not so clear cut in lacrosse. So 100 years hasn't made a lot of difference.
Lacrosse is probably the only sport in Canada now that the senior amateur level still exists. You know, you look at senior men's hockey really died in the 60s. Right. Senior men's football, the precursor to the CFL, died in the 50s. You know, amateur soccer doesn't really have any sort of on the same level. So senior amateur leagues today, it's almost an anachronism if you look at the greater picture of Canadian sports, and that's why there is that kind of, you still have that conflict.
Right, and there's a lot of talk behind the scenes about payments made for key players and that sort of thing. Did the pro teams play for the Mann Cup?
No. So the Minto, it started out as an amateur trophy. The professionals eventually took it over. And eventually in 1910, Donald Mann decided, he actually wanted to donate a football trophy, but the Grey Cup beat him to it. So there was this vacuum for an amateur lacrosse trophy. So he donated the Mann Cup, and that's strictly always been a senior trophy. You know, today there's always talk if there's players getting played under the table, but at least until the 60s and 70s, that amateur requirement was always very strictly followed. When there was the pro league in the late 60s, those teams like the Salmon Bellies, they were banned from playing for the Mann Cup for those 2 years because they were getting a paycheck.
Okay, so what happened to the Minnow Cup?
The Minnow Cup was last competed for, I think, in 1924.
Yeah.
And the Mann Cup, of course, continued from 1910 all the way through. So when the professional league was completely gone in Canada by 1924, so the question arose, what are we going to do with this cup? We've established the Mann Cup. That's the one we play for. There's no more professional teams. What are we going to do with this cup? So the cup went into storage in New Westminster because New Westminster had basically retained that cup, except for 1 year, 1911, and one other year when I think 1921 Vancouver might have won it, yeah. But New Westminster had the physical possession of the cup, and it went into storage in New Westminster, and it stayed in storage. It was basically lost, which is kind of an interesting, funny story in its own right. Do you want to tell them?
Yeah, Charlie Welch, he was actually the last trustee, and he was involved with the Salmon Bellies, but he was actually the trustee that oversaw the Minto Cup competition. And what happened was that Vancouver, Con Jones pulled out of lacrosse, so suddenly there's a one-team league in 1924, and so New Westminster just sat on the cup. And Charlie Welch went and stuck it in his office. He worked for the Harbor Commission. And then I think it was I don't know when he died, but let's say 1937 or so. The CLA decided they were going to reinstitute the Minto Cup. There had been talk actually of making it the international trophy in the 20s, but in the 30s, the CLA said, hey, let's have it for a Junior A trophy. And when it kind of came about, the stories, there's a lot of different telling on the story. Like I've tried to piece all the facts together, and there seems to be some overlaps and stuff. But the general story is that when it got around to like, okay, we're going to now award it to the juniors, where's the trophy? And just as they were looking for the trophy, Charlie Welch passed away. And his wife passed away the same night, actually. And basically, they couldn't find the trophy, and he was the only one that could have deeded it over to the CLA, or his wife, who had now passed away. So the search went on for the trophy. I've heard anything from, it took him 6 to 9 months to find it, and they found it packaged away underneath his desk at the Harbor Commission office. And while this was going on, the CLA contacted whoever the descendant of the original Lord Minto, who was another Lord Minto, and they wrote to him in Scotland and said, hey, can you deed this trophy over to us, because we have no other legal recourse to it. So the CLA was able to get control of the Minto Cup, and then when he found it, it got into the junior ranks. So yeah, it's got a pretty interesting history behind it. So
I think it was first awarded in 1937.
Yeah,
for
and
juniors.
I've been trying to track down whether the first juniors, and I think it was an Aurelia team or something like that, actually even got the Minnow Cup this year, or if they were still searching. Like the only sources for this info is newspapers, and there's so much contradiction.
And that would have been for box lacrosse, not field.
It would have been
lacrosse.
box lacrosse. Yeah, field lacrosse had died by 31, 32 range. So.
Very good. All right. And so, who were the pro teams in British Columbia? Just two, or?
Well, this is really David's expertise, but fundamentally there were two teams in the Pro League. It was the New Westminster Salmon Bellies and the Vancouver Lacrosse Club. There were some other entries. I think maybe Victoria might have had an entry in there. I'm not even sure about that.
Victoria was gone before.
Were they?
Yeah.
It was fundamentally just the two teams, but the rivalry was so great and the interest was so high that you only really needed the two teams.
Yeah.
It drove everything.
Although Vancouver was, New West was very consistent. It was the New Westminster Salmon Bellies throughout that era, but Vancouver, there were different Vancouver teams. When Con Jones was, getting frustrated in New Westminster and he'd walk away, other Vancouver people would come in and step in. The Vancouver Athletic Club were one of the first Man Cup dynasty teams. So they won the Man Cup for about 3 or 4 years. And they had nothing really else to challenge. And they're like, well, let's us challenge for the Minnow Cup. Of course, staying in them as professionals, they now had to go and play in the Pro League. And they just didn't have the money to do that. And they folded after about 1.5 years. And then Con Jones would come back. So the New West team was very consistent, but the Vancouver teams, when you look at Vancouver Lacrosse Club, the Vancouver Terminals, the Vancouver Athletics, there was a lot more, it was a little more loosey-goosey with who was running the team, who was paying for it, who was playing for them. There was actually 2 pro leagues at one time with 2 Vancouver teams playing on the same day, competing for the same fans. So it was a little more complex in Vancouver.
I've seen some of the beautiful photographs of the crowds. And how did they move that many people between the two cities, to see these games?
By 1891, they built an inner city, New Westminster, Fraser Valley, Vancouver, interurban. So it was a railway system that ran between the two cities. BC Electric Company ran it, electric railway system. So they had a line that ran between Vancouver and New Westminster, of course. But the demand, we're talking about a time period when there's pretty much still horse and buggy. Cars were starting to come in, but there weren't many on the roads. The roads weren't that good. So the only way to get between the two cities really was by railway. So what they did was the demand for space on these rail cars was so great, they actually built, 6 or 7 special cars. They were kind of tiered. The seating was tiered so that you could get more people on the cars. And they were kind of rudimentary. You can see the pictures.
They look pretty sketchy.
Pretty sketchy, safety-wise, But that's okay. The fans in Vancouver, they'd had a few drinks, and they weren't going to fall off, I'm sure. But they'd all pack on Vancouver and come into New Westminster, and then go back the same way, and vice versa with these special cars. It's an indication of just how popular the game was that you had to build special railway cars.
It sounds like it was quite a party. It must have really driven the area.
It was huge.
It's something to do, entertainment, and when was that? Saturday afternoon. Saturday afternoons.
They played the games. The games in those days, the early field games, were always played Saturday afternoons at 3 o'clock, without fail. That was it, and the reason for that was because most people worked, a 6-day-a-week job. But towards the early 1900s, the employers started giving people like a half a day off in the afternoon. So this is where the social history interacts with sports history. So Saturday afternoon was when people could actually get to the games. Otherwise, they were working.
Finally, a window for recreation.
Finally, a window for recreation. Yeah. And so a lot of factors, like in anything else in life, a lot of factors came together and to allow the popularity to take off. So Saturday afternoon, there was only one game in town, and that was lacrosse, and that was all across Canada. It was Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. If someone was wanting to write a history book, you'd call it Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, history of lacrosse. That's when it was played. And that's how they could draw those big crowds, because people weren't working all the time. I should also say, in regard to that 1911 really was, in my opinion, I don't know about you, David, but my opinion, lacrosse never got bigger than in 1911.
Still hasn't today.
I say that to people and they kind of look at me funny. But it's true. If you look at the numbers, you look at the interest, you look at all the indicators, even the press interest, lacrosse reached a peak, really a peak in 1911, which is a long time ago. What do you get to say about that?
In my work, I kind of zeroed in 1911 because one, Vancouver was able to wrestle the Minnow Cup away from New West with a ringer team led by New Zealand Lawn, but the crowds were massive. It was also, again, I mentioned earlier about the start of hockey, and that was the first year of hockey coming in, and I always find it that is a weird, an ominous kind of,
like a tipping point.
Yeah, it was almost a bit like, okay, that was the first year the hockey came in and was going to slowly start denting the fan base, because, like, look, one thing that's lost with the lacrosse crowds, like, we hear about 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, but you got to look at the population of the area at the time, and an equivalent would be like, I'm not sure what New Westminster's population was back then, but Vancouver's
20 to 30,000.
Yeah, Vancouver's was pretty small. It was not what it was today. That it'd be like the Vancouver Canucks drawing 250,000 people per game. Yeah. Like, if you look at it percentage-wise of how many people went to these games, like, it was huge.
Just for my own interest, do any of those railway cars still exist that were from that era? Did they save any of them?
No.
I don't know of any if they do exist.
Yeah.
The interurbans, a couple of the interurban tram cars exist. There's one that actually still, you can run it out in Surrey. But I don't know, if you've seen pictures, we actually got a photograph of one of those tram cars a few years ago, donated us. They are really sketchy. It is literally, it's like a plank of wood, some rails, and then maybe a little railing, and you just climb on there, and yeah, you wouldn't be able to ride the thing today.
This was before a litigious society.
Yeah, you take it in your own hands, yeah.
On that note, I'll tell you what does exist if you're a really hardcore transportation or maybe a lacrosse fan. You can walk or drive the streets of New Westminster to this day, and you can see a ripple effect in certain roads, a ripple effect where the railway ties used to be that carried these tram cars, because they had spur lines that all fed into Queen's Park, where the Salmon Bellies played, not in the arena, but in what's now the stadium at Queen's Park, where all the games were played. And so the ripple of the corrugated effect is still there in the streets. You can see it, over the years the pavement has settled, but the shape of the railway ties is still there. So if you're looking for remnants of those days, they still exist in New Westminster in many of the streets.
Not quite on par with like the Roman Empire in England and some of the old roads.
Some of us put it on par with the Appian Way in Rome.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of us think that it's just as important, right, David?
Yeah.
Well, I tend to agree with you. There we go. So let's talk about the equipment back then. What kind of sticks did they play with, and how did that affect the game?
I don't know. I've actually, having handled some of these sticks and knowing what the modern ones are like, I don't know how they did play with them, to put it honest, because they're really field sticks. Like, they're almost like what the wood goalie sticks that you still see around are like, because the goalies and the runners used the same sticks in field lacrosse back then, but they didn't have the deep pockets. You couldn't have you could only have one shooting string according to the rules, which was basically, it was almost more of a guide string to keep other sticks from hooking onto each other. It wasn't actually anything to do with shooting with them, but yeah, I don't know how they played, and it's interesting because what little film footage exists, you try to study it, and it's like the motion is still the same in the game, but you kind of wonder how they were able, like, I think it was more of just a one-on-one game, and if the ball went on the ground, then you'd have a big scrap for the ball, but there was not a lot of passing. And when you started getting some of, like, Grumpy Spring was probably the first guy that could shoot on the fly, basically do shoot, like, basically catch and shoot at the same time. And quick stick, that's the term I'm trying to think. He was probably the pioneer of that, behind somebody coming around behind the net, passing to him, and he would just quick stick it in. And it was considered, they scored him a lot of goals because other guys couldn't do it. Goalies couldn't stop it. But that's pretty basic stuff today. But our sticks allow for that now.
Well, you bring up Grumpy Springs, and wasn't his brother Doey?
Doey,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah, and then you had Newsy, and talk about great.
They all had great nicknames.
Yeah. Fat Painter's my favorite.
What was that one?
Fat Painter. He was a defenseman for Vancouver. The guy was actually fit as a fiddle. So I don't know why they call him fat, but yeah.
He had
Fat
Bones.
Painter.
He had on the Vancouver team. He had Bones Allen.
Bones Allen.
Yeah, just wonderful names back then, and real color, there. Let's. Okay. On that note, who are some of the big stars from that day?
You want to do the New West? I'll do the Vancouver.
Well, New Westminster had the Giffords. There were at one time there were 4 Giffords that played on the Salmon Bellies. Jimmy Gifford, Tommy Gifford. I'm going to forget some of the other, but the Gifford brothers were big. They had other sets of brothers, the Turnbull brothers, the Spring brothers that we just talked about, Doey and Grumpy Spring.
Did you ever hear how they got their nicknames?
We don't know.
Well, Doey.
Well, you know about
Doey got his name as a youngster. He worked in a bakery.
Okay.
He worked in a bakery, and for some reason the name Doey stuck. He was anything but Doey. He had a long career. He made the transition into box lacrosse.
Wow.
Played a whole bunch of box lacrosse games and scored goals. And he was in his 40s or something like that, late 40s I think. So he was an amazing athlete. Grumpy didn't quite play as long. People assume Grumpy that he was some kind of a curmudgeon, but everything I've ever heard about him is that he was a real sweet-natured guy, and he really in my opinion, single-handedly, he was around for the transition to box lacrosse and coached and the team through the box lacrosse era, and as well as being a star in the. He scored as many goals. Grumpy Spring. David might disagree a bit here, but Grumpy Spring scored as many goals as Newsy Lalonde. He's not as well known.
Newsy scored the most, and he scored probably. Well, we don't know who scored the most in Canada, but for the pro players, Newsy scored the most. But on the West Coast, Grumpy holds that record.
Wow. And you had a few from Vancouver?
So the Vancouver, obviously Newsy Lalonde, who, he's not native to Vancouver, but he played probably half his career on the West Coast. Vancouver's weird because there was a lot of imports, but there was also a lot of good homegrown players. Import-wise, they had a guy named Bun Clark, who was probably one of the best goalies of the day. He came west. He actually ended up with New West for most of it, but he was brought west with Vancouver. Bones Allen, he was one of the great midfielders of the first decade of the 20th century. He came west.
Billy Fitzgerald.
He
was paid as much as Newsy Lalonde to play for the Vancouver
he
team.
played a couple years here. But then locally, there was the Mathesons, George Matheson. He was a defensive midfielder. He played for about 10 years of the pro era. He retired around 1920 or so. Fat Painter, he was a defenseman in the 20s. Johnny Howard. Johnny Howard's a really interesting guy. I'm going to pitch him. I always say he should be in the Hall of Fame. He's not. He won 9 or 10 Minnow Cups with 3 teams with Montreal. He came up with the Montreal dynasty. And then he came west, played for Vancouver, and then New Westminster stole him away, and then he went back to Vancouver. He may be the only player, I don't know if there's any junior records of players winning 3 Minto Cups or with 3 teams, but he did it. Wow. And he was an outstanding player, defenseman. So he's probably why you don't hear a lot about him, because it's usually the goal scorers that you hear about. Vancouver's roster compared to New West, Vancouver had a lot more turnover, because of who was running the team and who was bankrolling it. And when there was no money there, all the Easterners would go back east, and then the locals that were kind of cut would come out of the woodwork. New Westminster was interesting because there was a lot of brothers that played on that team.
New Westminster was pretty much the whole team for pretty much their whole reign in the early days of field lacrosse. They were all New Westminster products. They were all guys that grew up in the city, that played in the city's very robust lacrosse organization. You had a team in the West End, and you had the team in sort of the center of the city, the Queen's Park area, the team in Sapperton, and it was the most popular game. All the boys played it, and they all competed pretty fiercely against each other. And the best of those 3 teams might, make it onto the senior Salmon Bellies team, it was an honor, and you had to be absolutely the best. They weren't taking anybody that wasn't the best player. And it was that team from those early days, Salmon Bellies, that really set the tone to today. Because if you're a Salmon Belly, you understand that you're on the floor for one reason. You're meant to win. Right. There's no apologizing for winning, and there's no excuse for not winning. Yeah. It's still very much part of the culture of the team, and it's those guys that set that culture.
Way back then, yeah. All right, let's shift a little bit later on, and box lacrosse came into being. Let's hear a little bit about the beginning of box.
Well, I can start with that a little bit. The field game was dying through the 1920s. There was a team from New Westminster, 2017 won the Man Cup that year, and because they won the Man Cup, they were selected to be on the became the Canadian Olympic team that went to Amsterdam in 1928, and that's an interesting story in itself. But the game was really in serious trouble, serious decline. So serious that even the most orthodox of organizations, if I can put it that way, the Canadian Lacrosse Association, recognized that something had to be done. So what came to the rescue were a number of Montreal lacrosse fans and hockey, not fans, but organizers, players that played lacrosse and hockey in Montreal, started experimenting in probably the mid to late 20s, experimenting with the game. How could you make it faster? How could you make it more interesting? How could it be more pleasing to a crowd? Because in field lacrosse, the ball would go flying off the field. You'd have to wait for 30 seconds or a minute for the ball to come back. You're playing on a big field with lots of players. It was just deemed to be too slow all around. And there were other factors that led to the decline, but that's one of them. And it was also, a lot of people thought, too violent. But that may be overstated in my opinion. But anyway, by the late 20s, it was really dying. And so the decision was made by the lacrosse authorities to adopt what they had experimented with in Montreal, which was putting lacrosse into a hockey arena in the summertime with some kind of surface. It wasn't always, it was often sort of the sand that was down on top of the pipes that did the freezing. For hockey, they'd play on that surface, and some of them, like in New Westminster around this time, they put in a wooden floor on top of on top of the pipes that did the freezing. And they found that the players, there was a lot of field lacrosse players, would experiment with this new game. They didn't really understand what kind of game it was going to be. They were experimenting. So they'd have 12 guys on a side, they'd have 9 guys. Eventually, they kind of settled on having a goalie and 5 players out with a 6th that was a rover.
Yes.
And so they tried all sorts of things to see what would be the best combination. But what was universally thought by the players was that this was a faster, more exciting, spectator-friendly kind of a game. And so even the old field guys had to say, hey, this is a pretty good game. It bears a resemblance to the old game, but it's more faster, it's more exciting, and it's in an arena, and we can get the hockey crowds are going to be in the arena, then we can probably get some summer people in those arenas and fill the arena. So it worked for the arena owners because they could the idea was they would fill the rinks in the summer when they didn't have hockey. So it was thought to be a very good solution to save the game.
And that's really what made Canada different than the rest of the world, like the British Empire or the United States, where the field game kept going through the school system, the academic system, and it was saved, because you had the Ivy Leagues and carrying the game forward. Canada really, the backs were up against the wall, had to find a way to keep it going. Even the move to the Olympics, that's going to be in 2028, it'll be a different brand of the game than we've ever seen before, because there's certain Olympic criteria that need to be met with numbers of people on teams, and how the game will be played, and duration of the game. So that'll be another flavor of the game that comes out of an opportunity, I guess. So what's new is old, and old is new, and that sort of thing. Let's see. Here's a good question here. Salmon Bellies, how did they get their name? Like one of the great sport names. You know, in baseball you have the Toledo Mud Hens, and you know, a lot of great names like that in AAA baseball. But Salmon Belly is an iconic name, and you know, because it is so different. And you know, like, what's the story behind that?
Well, the Salmon Bellies, New Westminster was laid out, founded in 1859 by the Royal Engineers, and their nickname was the Sappers. To this day, they're known as Sappers. So in New Westminster, we have Sapperton to this day. Of course, famously, the British Army wears bright red jerseys, and as did the Sappers. So by you go at 20, 30 years after the founding of New Westminster, there's still a lot of these pioneers, these sappers still alive, and there's very much a British flavor in New Westminster. So when it came time to choose a color for the team, the only choice really was red, because it represents the sapper, the British Army. It's the redcoats are coming, right? So that was the color. So that's the initial impetus. Little did they know, though, that for most people, Vancouver and elsewhere in Canada have no idea about the Royal Engineers necessarily. All they see is this bright red jersey coming at them. And it reminded a lot of people of the color of a spawning salmon, the salmon belly. The belly of the salmon gets very red in the spawning season. Now, New Westminster is on the Fraser River, one of the largest sockeye and other salmon runs in the world. There were as many as 11 or 12 canneries in New Westminster. So New Westminster in the 1890s was known as a salmon canning place. And here's this team with this bright red jerseys. And importantly, this team is coming at you as if they are the British Army. There's lots of spectators quoted in newspapers back in those days. And they talk about, boy, that looks like the charge of the Light Brigade or something coming at us, you know, with that red color. So the red color of the sapper led to the spawning salmon and the cannery, and it stuck because it was true. You know, it looked like a salmon belly. New Westminster was a salmon city, a cannery city. So it stuck, and at first there was probably some resistance by they were called the New Westminster Lacrosse Club, quite proudly so. And so this nickname was really a derogatory thing that the other fans from other cities would throw at them, call them, you know, sort of dirty salmon bellies. Right? It was like a lowly kind of a thing to be. But as so often happens in life, and certainly in sports, you hear it enough times, you start to maybe like the nickname, you know? You might be a short guy, but they call you, some tall nickname. And so even though it was meant derogatorily, you take that on for yourself psychologically. So by the late 1890s, the New Westminster Lacrosse Club players are very proudly wearing ribbons and buttons and calling themselves salmon bellies. I mean, if that's what they're going to call us, we're going to go with that and not fight it. And that's how it started, and that's how it stayed.
Because the other teams had, like, it was an insult thrown at them, but like there was like the Crab Eaters, and there was another team, Victoria, I can't remember which. They had these seafood related nicknames, and
that's right.
They didn't stick, but salmon bellies did. So
the Clam Diggers, I think,
the
Crab Eaters.
Crab Eaters and Clam Diggers, yeah.
Salmon bellies, it was all. You know, these sort of rotten nicknames for each other, but only one stuck because it was true. You know, there were salmon canneries and salmon in the Fraser River, so it stuck.
Yeah. A few more questions, guys. Salmon Bellies practically owned the Minnow Cup after they won it from the Montreal Shamrocks in 1908. But the team has won more Man Cups than any other team, 24 of them, and yet it is a small city, proud city, small city. How do they do it? How do the Salmon Bellies do it?
Well, it had a great, really because of the early days of the salmon bellies and being the only sport, that tradition, through the efforts of a lot of individuals, such as Grumpy Spring and others, there's a tradition where the veteran players become coaches, become managers, and everything sort of perpetuates itself. Everything rolls forward. The guys that played the game really loved it so much that they wanted to bring others into the fold. And New Westminster being basically a blue-collar town, and sports being, you know, integral to that, and a tradition of excellence in lacrosse. So you have great minor organizations, great coaching from very good players. All the ingredients were there to perpetuate the tradition through the decades. And that's how the city's done it. Really, the efforts of a lot of individuals giving freely of their time.
Now, a number of years ago, I brought my 2 daughters' box lacrosse team to a tournament, Dorothy Robertson tournament, I believe. And we were very fortunate to play a couple of games in Queen's Park Arena on the wood floor, you know, which I had hoped might happen. And tell us about the arena and when it was built and, you know, what that did for things.
The arena was basically built on the ashes of what was called the Royal Agricultural and Industrial Exhibition. It was a huge fair like you'd see in Toronto at the C&E, that kind of thing. It was for the whole of really the lower mainland and a little bit Vancouver Island. So it was all about, you know, vegetables and farmers and bringing things to market, but it was about horses and cattle and shows. And there was a huge array of buildings in Queen's Park from about 1890 through to about 1929, all horse stables, barns, large buildings to house these exhibits. It was just a massive thing. And about 1929, these were getting to be, you know, fairly old structures. Somehow or other, they caught fire, and the whole thing burned to the ground in one inferno one night. And partially from the proceeds of the insurance money, again, it was lacrosse people who were also heavily involved in the civic side of the city, took that money, and they decided on the ashes of this agricultural exhibit to build a new arena. And so the arena went in about 1930, 31. They were building the arena, and it just happened to coincide, the timing, with the death of the field lacrosse. Yeah. And the birth of box. The timing couldn't have been better. So there was some real foresight. I mean, you couldn't have foreseen the fire, but there was some real foresight about what kind of a facility to build. It wasn't originally built as an arena. It was open on either end. You can still see the remains of that. It was meant to be a kind of a civic auditorium, but they eventually closed in the ends. And for the first 5 or 6 years, they'd play on a kind of a dirt floor that was above the pipes that were used for the rink. But in about 1937, I think, or 36, they put in the famous wooden floor.
What were some of the great salmon belly teams and some of the great players? Maybe just spend a couple minutes going through that.
There's so many great teams, really, over the years. But I think I would look at the sort of the late 1920s salmon bellies teams. The 27 team went to Amsterdam representing Canada at the Olympics that year. In the early 30s was a bit of a lull for New Westminster, but by 1936, in the efforts of a fellow named Fred Hume, who was the mayor of New Westminster and the president of the team, imported some pivotal Eastern players. Nothing changes. These are some of the biggest stars from back east, from a really Terriers team actually. Brought them in, about 4 players. They won the Mann Cup in 1937. That's one of my favorite teams, is the 37 team. Again, they had great teams through the 40s, war years, but they kept playing lacrosse in New Westminster, about one of the only teams to continue to do it. The Army and the Navy and the Air Force had teams, but it was still the salmon bellies, which tells you something about the salmon bellies. And then in the 1930s, there was a team that I'd like to mention that was another New Westminster senior men's team called the New Westminster Adanacs. So you had in this tiny city of maybe 40, 50,000 people at that point, you had another senior men's team called the Adanacs, which is Canada spelled backwards. Yeah. And they wore these distinctive purple and gold uniforms, and they were just arch rivals of the salmon bellies. People would cross the street not to talk to somebody who was an Adanac or salmon belly. These teams did not like one another. The rivalry was just fierce, and the Adanacs were worthy rivals to the salmon bellies and actually won the Mann Cup in, I think it was 1939. So they got there, and then the war years interrupted. Then the 50s was a bit of a beginning of the 50s was a bit of a downward years. However, in about 1955 or 6, some fellows named Jack Fulton and Harry McKnight came on the scene and brought in one of, probably by most accounts, the greatest player ever in Canadian box lacrosse, Jack Biano. They brought him to New Westminster, and Mr. Fulton decided, okay, we're gonna win. We're gonna get this back on track, and we're gonna win this Mann Cup, and we're gonna do it in a couple of years. And by 1958, they'd done it. They built a powerhouse team, 58, 59 salmon bellies, Jack Bionda and other great players, not just, you can't do it alone, but they won the Mann Cup in those years, and then that tradition continued through the 1960s when New Westminster won 3 or 4 Mann Cups, into the early 70s when the team dominated Canadian lacrosse. And that tradition continued actually through the 80s and into the early 90s when New Westminster was a perennial competitor for the Mann Cup and won, again, 4 or 5 cups in that time period. So you kind of, when you talk about the Sandbills, you have to look at sort of the decades. The winning tradition is kind of unbroken through all those decades, really.
David, anything you could tell us about Jack Bionda, because he was such a unique figure, an NHL player, and one of the great boxers.
Jack Bionda, before my time and after my time, actually. From what I've heard about him, actually from read, I would rank him, if my top 5 lacrosse players of all time, he's number 2.
Number 2.
Number 2.
Newsy was 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so let's go on that track.
So,
who was 3, 4, and 5 for you?
The Gates, both brothers, and I'd probably say John Tavares.
That's
And
a
then
pretty healthy-
don't ask me after that, because it just goes wide
You
out.
wouldn't mind
But
having those 5 on the floor for you.
And I would counter with Paul Parnell and Wayne Goss.
yeah. Bruce is he's always pushing new West guys.
What about
and
Bobby
I'm always,
Allen?
Who?
Bobby Allen.
I'm kidding.
Bobby
Kidding.
would be.
Yeah, of course he'd be there.
Yeah, Jack. I always say I'm too young to have seen Jack play, and you can only get so much for reading. But what struck, I was aware what a great player he was. But when we were at the old hall, and I'd be in there on a Saturday working away, and people would come in, hey, can we take a look around the hall and stuff? And this kind of actually helped build my list of great players, is because I'd listen to them talk. You'd have a dad and his 2 kids, and they'd be looking around and pointing at stuff. And the dad would always say, they'd always talk about Jack Bionda. Jack Bionda, a great player. Did this, he played, he did play hockey, but he was a primary lacrosse player. And the kids always talk about the Gates and stuff like that. So I always found that those were the 2 players that people talked about. You see the wall, the old wall of heroes we had with the photographs, and it was, where do they focus on? The older people would go to Jack Bionda. The youngers would, they would ask him, well, do you have any stuff at the Gates? Well, there's a stick over there or something like that. But yeah, everything I've heard about from old timers and from what I read, he was just such a force. He probably could have played longer than he did. And when, I think his last season, he played with the Portland team in 1968 when there was the first pro league, and he went down to Portland. And he was an old Western Hockey League player with the Buckaroos, and he was Portland thought they just won the lottery. Wow, we got a lacrosse team, and we got Jack Bionda playing for him. Yeah, it was huge for them.
It's interesting. I saw Jack put on probably one of his final public displays at a Rock game in year 2 of the Toronto Rock at halftime, and unbelievable what he could do with the stick and the ball, and these windmill moves with the ball. And I was just so glad I got to see that and understand. Here's a guy in his early 60s that could do something like that. It was amazing. And through the game, I've met some of his offspring. He has, I don't know if it'd be a great granddaughter or whatever, who's now playing women's field lacrosse, and he just met her at a thing I was doing back east. And so it's fun, great to see these names keep going. I guess to close off, it's a good thing that you talked about the old hall, and that it was at Centennial.
Centennial. It was built for the Canada Games.
Yeah, so
67.
67, and that was a great home for the artifacts. And I went there a few times over the years, and that was near Queen's Park, I remember. You could get to it easily from Queen's Park. And I know the concept for that started 63 or something like that. We'll be talking later on with a gentleman who had a lot to do with that. And then the new place where we are right now, beautiful place, and that was 2014, right? When that opened.
2013 we moved in, and then we did a soft open.
And this is a place that any lacrosse person in the world should come by and see the beginning of you've got the Mann and the Minnow Cups here, just absolutely beautiful trophies, no matter what the sport. And and some of the memorabilia here that you have out. As we move into a virtual world, I know a lot more things will be shared through digitalization and that sort of thing. And
that's actually my current project right now I'm working on, is going through our program collection and doing digital scanning to get them out and about, because a part of the problem with printed matter is you can put it on display, but people want to look through it. They want to look through the pictures, but you can't expose them to public access. So back in June, when we finally secured a high-resolution scanner, I'm going through our whole collection and scanning the covers as partly to document what we've got, because we also don't know what we have, but also scanning these images and trying to get them out there online where people can see them.
now I understand you have like 3,000. You've done 3,000 of those already, something like that.
2,000 or something. I don't know. I'd probably end up having to do 3,000. It's a work in progress, but
Wow.
it's really for me it's also a learning thing, because I'm not as versed in the box era as Bruce is. So when I'm scanning along, of course I'm reading some of this stuff too, and learning about these players who Bruce's research and stuff like that, and who I've heard about, but I don't know I don't know the details. We hear so much about Jack Biondi being great and Bobby Allen being great, but we don't know the stories of what made them great or what set them apart and stuff like that. And I tried to do that a little bit with my field work. Why was Grumpy a great player? What set him apart from Dowie? What set him apart from Newsy and stuff like that? But those stories, they're hard to track down, and they're starting to get lost as well. So
Well, through this project and others, hopefully we can keep some of these stories going. And we're talking to a lot of people that are 80 plus in years, and even up to 100 years old. And hopefully these will be stories that will be shared for a long, long time through the different halls of fame. So thank you very much for being with us today.
yeah.
Can I add something on the Lacrosse Hall of Fame here?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
The Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame is very much a work in progress. We're very lucky to have a facility like this. We're here at the Anvil Center. We're part in terms of the organization of the New Westminster Museum, but we're our own separate gallery here. We're a work in progress, but there's lots to see. We're always working on our website. David works on the artifacts. But I feel we're very lucky to be here in this facility. This is a first-class facility. And we're here because of cooperation with the City of New Westminster. And there's some individuals on our board who did a lot of work to make sure that we got in here and have this fine facility for lacrosse fans, fans of the game, to come and see things here. So even though we're a work in progress, there's lots to see, and we're very lucky to be here. Thanks to the ongoing support of the City of New Westminster. Not every city is going to do that, but that's the strength of this city.
Well, it's really important to have backers for these things. And one day, all the work that David's doing on the imaging, and hopefully we can connect, like the U.S. Lacrosse Hall of Fame. Manchester has a Hall of Fame in England. It should be something that somebody can just type in a few letters on their computer and bring up the whole history of the game through the different centers. One day we can get there, I guess.
We'd like to, David and I and the rest of the board would really love to sort of contextualize, that's a sort of historian kind of talk, but we'd like to take the honored members, the inductees in the fame here, of which there's 400 or 500, and kind of put them back into their teams, the teams that they played for, because it's a team game after all. It's not tennis or golf. So we want to put them back in the teams they played. We believe that that's the way to tell the story, to best serve the individuals that are in this hall, is by putting them back into the teams that they played on, so that people can have a sense of what made these players great, what made these teams great, and why people should care about it.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a fantastic job, and I think more is being. A little while back, not many people were interested in the history, but it just seems that there's getting to be more and more interest.
It's a struggle, though. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I know when I got into it, I got into my field because it already been, Larry Power and Stan Shillington had already dealt with the box game, and the field game just needed to be dealt with. But sometimes There are people that are coming out of the woodwork, but we could certainly do with a lot more researchers.
Well, there you go. There's a future there for some young lacrosse.
I always
people
worry
to-
about who comes after us. You know, I know that in some areas the torch is being handed to me and handed to Bruce, but who's gonna inherit our work? when
Well,
we're-
we'll keep the faith, okay?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a little story, a parallel story with stick makers.
Yeah.
It felt to me maybe 8-9 years ago we were down to about 3. It seemed like that. And then as you started researching around both sides of Lake Ontario and elsewhere, there's actually probably about 15 good stick makers out there that are keeping the game. And that's a similar kind of, you're stick makers in your own way,
Yeah.
so.
Well, having the internet helps too. Like, stuff that I did couldn't have been done 20, 30 years ago, and same with Bruce. Like, me and Bruce would not have met, kind of thing, if it wasn't because we've been searching for the same stuff and you cross paths online and stuff like that. And I know there are researchers in the States that are out there doing their own thing, but 10 or 20 years ago, we wouldn't have had that ability to communicate. So I hope that, having an online presence will help get more people involved or more networking involved.
Well, a few years ago, I attended a major conference in Halifax called the Transnational Lacrosse Convention, and they had people from all over the world attend that were lacrosse fanatics. So sometimes we don't know what's out there, but there's a robust group that want to keep the history, like Jane Clayton from Scotland, just amazing. Some First Nations storytellers like Louis DeLille that we met back in Montreal had a great sense of the history.
Don Fisher.
Yeah,
Don
Don
Fisher.
Fisher from Niagara. Yeah,
Brings
in
an
the US.
incredibly valuable,
Yeah,
deeply academic, research-based approach to the game.
yeah. And then on the kind of the oral tradition, Faith Keeper side, Delmore Jacobs and Oren Lyons, and so what a unique group we have that tell the whole story when it all comes together.
I know of I've been in correspondence with somebody from Australia who's basically trying to compile every rule change since the day of beers, pretty much, to put it simply. Like, he's been trying to track down all the different rules, and he's saying, well, what did they use this year? What did they use this year? Do you have any documentation and stuff like that? It's just incredible.
Well, it's a game that deserves this kind of attention, but thanks again, guys, for being here today, and a really interesting conversation.
Welcome, pleasure.
Thanks.